Right now, while you read these words, something is commenting on them, evaluating whether they are worth your time, composing a verdict. And this commentary has been running, without interruption, without consent, since you woke up this morning, possibly before. There is a threshold in shallow sleep where thought begins to reassemble itself before the day officially begins. And by the time you are fully conscious, the voice is already mid-sentence. By the time you walked to the bathroom, it had already constructed a version of the day ahead. By the time you sat down with whatever you sit down with in the morning, it had already rehearsed 2 conversations, revisited something from 3 weeks ago, and calculated how far behind you already are. You did not ask for any of this. It simply happened. It has been happening every day for as long as you can remember. And because it has been happening for as long as you can remember, you have arrived at a conclusion so automatic that it barely registers as a conclusion, that this voice is you. This is the assumption the entire rest of your psychological architecture is built on. That the running commentary, the internal evaluation, the narrator saying, I should have handled that differently, and I need to be better at this, and why did I say that in 2014, and what if this goes wrong? You assume that voice is not a voice at all. You assume it is simply what thinking is. You assume it is simply what you are. But if you have ever attempted meditation, or stumbled into a moment of genuine stillness, or simply sat somewhere quiet for long enough that the noise began to reveal its own structure, you may have had a moment of something that is very hard to name. Not peace exactly, more like a sudden noticing, a noticing that the voice is speaking and that something is listening. And for a split second, before the voice reassembles around the observation and begins narrating the observation itself, you may have wondered, briefly, uneasily, which one is you? That question is one of the oldest in human inquiry. It appears in the Upanishads, in Zen koans, in Taoist paradoxes that are still circulating 2,500 years after they were written. Alan Watts spent a significant portion of his life circling it from different angles, returning to it from different traditions, restating it in different idioms, because no single framing ever quite exhausted it. It is not a question that rewards intellectual analysis in the conventional sense. It is a question that rewards something more, like a slow, patient, almost archaeological investigation of the structure of experience itself. And the investigation does not end with an answer. It ends with something more disorienting and more liberating than an answer. The discovery that the entity asking the question is not what it thought it was. Here is what this looks like from a slight elevation. You have a voice in your head. The voice talks. Something registers what the voice is saying. You, the something registering, then typically respond to the voice by generating more voice, which is registered by the same something, which generates more voice in return. This is so ordinary, so background, that it is nearly impossible to see without a moment of forced distance. But hold that description for a moment without collapsing back into the normal experience of it. The voice talks, something listens. They are not the same thing. This is not a mystical claim. It is a structural description of ordinary experience. When the voice says, I am so tired, there is something that notices this evaluation. When the voice says, I am a failure, there is something that receives this judgment, something that either accepts it, contests it, or is wounded by it. You would not be hurt by a judgment that came from nowhere. Something receives the impact, and what receives the impact cannot be identical with what delivers it. The judge and the judged, even when they appear to be the same person, occupy structurally different positions. The one who says, I am worthless, and the one who flinches at that statement are not the same. They cannot be. What is strange is how rarely this elementary observation is followed. You live inside this structure, the voice speaking, something listening, every hour of every day, and the assumption that the voice is the self is so deep, so prior to any reflection, that it functions less like a belief and more like the lens through which all beliefs are formed. You believe the things you believe about yourself through a narrator who is itself unexamined. You build an entire identity on top of a process you have never looked at directly. The process runs continuously, narrating, editing, revising, curating, producing the story called you, which you then inhabit as if it were a fact rather than a construction. Watts described this with characteristic directness in a lecture recorded at the Esalen Institute in the late 1960s. He said that the modern Western person has become so thoroughly identified with what he called the skin-encapsulated ego the sense of being a separate, bounded, narrating self, that this identification is experienced not as a point of view, but as reality itself. It is not that you believe you are a separate self. It is that the experience of being a separate self is the water you swim in. The fish does not believe in water. It simply swims. And if you were to suggest to the fish that there is something called water surrounding it at all times, the fish would have no reference point from which to even understand the claim. In 1966, Watts published what many consider his most direct and deliberate statement of this problem. The book, On the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are. The title is precise and intentional. Watts was not using taboo loosely. He meant that there is something in modern culture, in its educational systems, its psychological frameworks, the very language it uses to talk about selfhood, that actively prevents the question, who am I, really from being asked with full seriousness. Not because the question is dangerous in the conventional sense, but because what emerges in the place of an answer is structurally incompatible with the way modern life is organized. A society built around individual achievement, personal responsibility, self-improvement, self-branding, self-optimization, cannot function if the basic unit of all that striving turns out to be a fiction. So, the taboo is maintained not by law or punishment, but by the sheer density of distraction, the noise of the narrating mind, and the cultural consensus that this noise is what being a person consists of. The central argument of that book is not complicated, but its implications are vertiginous. Watts argued that what you call yourself, the voice, the narrator, the I making decisions and forming opinions and monitoring its own performance, is not a fixed entity that lives inside your skull and manages your experience from some central control room. It is a process, a pattern, a temporarily localized eddy in the flow of experience. He borrowed a figure from the Indian philosophical tradition. The wave that has forgotten, it is ocean. The wave is real. The wave is genuinely happening, but the wave is not separate from the water. It is a shape the water is temporarily making. When the shape concludes, the water does not lose anything. The pattern changes, the water remains. The narrator in your head is a wave in this sense. It is not nothing. It is a genuine pattern of activity, a real process, a coherent set of responses to experience, but it is not what it takes itself to be. It takes itself to be the person. It takes itself to be the one in charge. It takes itself to be the continuous, unified, persistent self who began somewhere in early childhood and has been accumulating experiences ever since. And this self-concept, this story the narrator tells about itself, is what Watts called the skin-encapsulated ego, the conviction that what you are is a small, separate, isolated consciousness inhabiting a body, surrounded by an external world that is other than you, competing with other small, separate, isolated consciousnesses for resources, recognition, and survival. This is not an obviously wrong description of ordinary experience. In ordinary experience, it feels quite accurate. You are here, and the table is there. You are inside your experience, and other people are outside it. You began, and at some point you will end, and in between you have a biography and a character and a set of preferences that distinguish you from everyone else. All of this is real in the sense that it is the operating layer of ordinary life. Watts was not saying it is an illusion in the sense of being non-existent. He was saying it is an illusion in the sense of being a partial map, mistaken for the territory. And the consequence of mistaking the map for the territory, of believing the narrator is the person, that the story is the self, is precisely the structural anxiety that modern people cannot locate the source of, cannot solve with any amount of optimization, and cannot medicate into permanent silence without the problem simply migrating to a different compartment of the same architecture. What actually is the inner voice, mechanically? This is not a question Watts alone was circling. Philosophers approached it from multiple directions long before him, and scientists would approach it from the opposite direction decades later. And they would find roughly the same shape, though they would call it by different names and emphasize different features of the structure. The voice is not random noise. It is not a malfunction of some normally silent system. It is the default operating mode of the human symbolic mind. Human beings are the only species, as far as we can determine, capable of making themselves the object of their own thought. You can think, I am thinking. You can then think, I am thinking about the fact that I am thinking. You can, in principle, continue this recursion indefinitely. The way two mirrors placed opposite each other produce an infinite corridor of reflections, each slightly smaller than the last, and none of them ever reaching a final end. This recursive self-reflective capacity is extraordinary. It is the source of planning, of moral reasoning, of art, of the ability to learn from your own past and imagine possible futures. Without it, human civilization does not exist. Every tool ever made, every institution ever built, every word in every philosophy book ever written, all of it emerges from the capacity to stand outside immediate experience and reflect on it. So, this capacity is not the problem. The problem is the confusion about what the capacity is reflecting on. Because here is what the narrator cannot do. It cannot see itself seeing. The eye, as Watts pointed out more than once, cannot see itself. It can see its reflection in a mirror, but the reflection is not the eye. The eye remains invisible to itself in the act of seeing, and the narrator, in the act of narrating, has the same structural limitation. It can narrate about the narrator. It can describe itself, analyze itself, criticize itself, construct elaborate theories about what kind of person it is. But in the act of doing all of this, something else is watching, and that something else, the watching, is not the narrator. The narrator is one of the things it watches. This observation is not new. The philosopher Immanuel Kant noticed it in the 18th century when he distinguished between the empirical self, the self as it appears in experience, as an object of reflection, and the transcendental subject, whatever it is that makes experience possible at all, which by definition cannot itself appear within experience without becoming something else. Kant treated this as an epistemological boundary. We cannot know the thing that knows. Later, the existentialists would come at it differently. Jean-Paul Sartre, in his early phenomenological work, The Transcendence of the Ego, made an argument that surprised even his fellow phenomenologists, that the ego, the narrating self, the I that appears in reflection, is not the source of consciousness, but an object within it. Consciousness, Sartre argued, is not self-consciousness in the sense of being focused on itself. It is simply consciousness, pure, intentional, directed at what it is directed at. The ego arises in reflection. It is not what reflects. It is what reflection produces. The narrator is a product of the awareness, not its author. Watts found Western philosophy's approach to this problem frustrating, not because it was wrong, but because it stopped short. It identified the structure. It named the paradox. And then it set it aside as a philosophical curiosity rather than following it through to its experiential implications, which is precisely what the Eastern traditions had been doing for 2,000 years. Here is where the paradox becomes unavoidable. If the investigating is done by the narrator, and the narrator is the thing being investigated, then every investigation produces a new layer of narration rather than a genuine exit from the narrating process. The tool you are using to examine the problem is the same as the problem. Every insight you have about the voice is an insight narrated by the voice. Every moment of, now I see what the mind is doing, is a moment the mind is orchestrating, filing, and incorporating into the ongoing story of a person who is becoming more self-aware. The self-aware self is still a self. The spiritual ego is still an ego. Watts described this trap with a specific image in the book, a person trying to bite their own teeth, not one tooth, the teeth as a complete set. The operation is structurally incoherent. The thing doing the biting is the thing being bitten, and the collapse of that distinction produces not union, but absurdity. The mind that tries to see itself as a complete object has the same problem. Every examination produces a new examiner. Every attempt to catch the narrator in the act of narrating generates a narrator narrating the attempt to catch the narrator. The recursion has no bottom. There is no final meta-level at which you can stand and see the whole mechanism clearly from outside. This is not a counsel of despair. Watts was careful about this. The impossibility of catching the self from the inside, from the position of the narrating mind, is not evidence that there is nothing to find. It is evidence that the investigative strategy is wrong. You cannot find the I by looking harder with the eye. This does not mean the I does not exist. It means the I is found differently, not by looking, but by noticing that seeing is already happening. Not by searching for the one who is aware, but by recognizing that awareness is present right now, before the search begins. The trap springs from the assumption that finding the self requires an act of self-directed attention, that you must locate yourself the way you locate your keys. But what you are looking for is not missing. It is what is looking. And the moment of recognition, if it comes, and it does not always come from trying, is less like finding something and more like realizing you were already standing in the room you were attempting to enter. The Mandukya Upanishad, one of the shortest and most concentrated of the ancient Indian philosophical texts, 12 verses in Sanskrit, describes consciousness as having 4 states: the waking state, in which you engage with the sensory world and the outer layer of the narrating mind; the dreaming state, in which the same mind generates experience internally; the deep sleep state, in which even the dream narrative ceases and there is nothing to report; and a 4th state, called turiya in Sanskrit, meaning simply the 4th, which is not a state at all in the ordinary sense. It is the awareness that underlies and makes possible all 3 other states. The waking self does not produce turiya. Turiya is what makes the waking self possible, what the Upanishad is pointing toward, and what Watts translated for Western audiences with considerable care across his career is the distinction between consciousness as content and consciousness as container. Your thoughts are content. Your emotions are content. Your memories, your plans, your self-concept, your running commentary. All content. And content requires a container. Thoughts occur in something. Experiences happen to something. The inner voice speaks, and something hears it. That something, not a thing, not a place, not a concept, but a presence, is what the Mandukya calls turiya. And the radical claim of the Advaita Vedanta tradition that surrounds this text is that this is not a deep or distant or difficult thing to locate. It is the first-person singular present tense of your experience, right now, before the narration begins. The I am before any predicate is added to it. Not I am anxious, or I am successful, or I am a person with this history and these difficulties. Just the bare I am, the sense of existing, the sense of being present. That, the tradition says, is what you actually are. And the narrator is a pattern running across that presence, not the presence itself. The Advaita teacher, Ramana Maharshi, who died in 1950 and whose work Watts engaged with extensively, particularly in the book and in several of the recorded Asalan seminars, offered what he considered the most direct method for investigating this. He called it Atma Vichara, self-inquiry. The instruction was simple in its formulation and vertiginous in its application. When a thought arises, any thought, any self-narration, any judgment or evaluation, trace the thought back to its source by asking, who is having this thought? The thought says, I am anxious. Ask, who is anxious? Another thought will arise to answer. Ask of that answer, who is the I here? And the instruction was not to answer this question with another thought, not to generate a verbal response to it, but to attend directly to the bare sense of I itself, the feeling of existing as a subject, before any description of that subject was added. The investigation done with full seriousness does not produce an answer. It produces a dissolving. The question pressed far enough does not find a someone. It finds something more like an opening, awareness without a fixed center, not nothing. The opposite of nothing, but not a bounded, located, narrating entity either. The Zen tradition arrived at something structurally similar by an entirely different path. Where Vedanta approaches the question through philosophical analysis, through the careful subtraction of what you are not until only what you are remains, Zen tends to approach it by inducing a collapse of the ordinary cognitive machinery. The Tang Dynasty teacher, Huang Po, whose teachings were recorded in the 9th century, and whose work Watts engaged with in depth in the way of Zen, said that the mind which seeks the Buddha is itself the Buddha. He did not mean this as a comforting affirmation. He meant it as a structural observation. The awareness that is searching for truth is itself truth-searching. The seeker and the sought are not two separate things that need to be brought together. They are one thing that has temporarily failed to notice itself. And when the cognitive apparatus that insists on their separation is pushed past its own limit, through concentrated, sustained, practically impossible questioning, something falls away. Not something gained, something released, a mistaken identity relinquished. The contemporary neuroscience says something similar, in different language, from a completely different direction. The default mode network, a set of brain regions first identified and formally named by Marcus Rachel and colleagues at Washington University in a paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2001, is the neural substrate of what researchers call resting state cognition. It is the network most active when you are not engaged in any specific task, not looking at anything in particular, not solving a problem, not responding to external demands. When the attention systems directed outward are at their lowest activity, the default mode network becomes most prominent. And what the default mode network does, as subsequent research established, is essentially what the inner voice does. It rehearses the past, simulates possible futures, thinks about other people's perspectives, constructs, and maintains the narrative of the self. It is, in a real neurological sense, the machine that runs the narrator. What is philosophically interesting about this finding is what it implies about the relationship between self-referential thought and what we ordinarily call attention. When you direct your attention outward, when you are fully engaged with a problem, a conversation, a physical movement, the default mode network quiets. The narrator steps back. The commentary softens. And this quieting is correlated in research conducted by Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert at Harvard. A study published in Science in 2010 using a real-time experience sampling method that reached over 2,000 participants across the course of their ordinary days, with increased reported happiness. The finding was counterintuitive. It was not the content of the mind wandering that predicted unhappiness. It was the wandering itself. People reported being less happy when their minds were wandering, regardless of whether the wandering thoughts were pleasant, unpleasant, or entirely neutral, than when they were fully engaged with whatever they were doing, even if what they were doing was not especially enjoyable. The narrator, in other words, does not simply report on experience. It appears to degrade it. The very act of self-referential commentary, the inner voice running its assessment of the present moment, seems to subtract something from the quality of presence itself. This is a finding Watts would have found consistent with his analysis, though he would have phrased it differently. He would not have said, the narrator degrades experience. He would have said, the narrator is a substitute for experience, a verbal map that is mistaken for the territory, so that the person is always engaged with their description of life rather than with life directly. A tourist who arrives in a city and thinks, ah, yes, this is the place I have read about, and in that very thought is no longer present in the place at all. The psychologist Stephen Hayes, developing what became acceptance and commitment therapy across the 1980s and 1990s, arrived at a clinical formulation of the same distinction. Hayes identified what he called cognitive fusion, the ordinary default relationship most people have with their thoughts, in which the thought is not experienced as a thought, but as reality. I am not good enough is not, in the fused state, a self-critical narration produced by a process. It is a factual assessment of status in the world, which the person then behaves in response to, as if that status were objectively established. The thought and the thinker collapse into one another. There is no distance between them, no recognition that the thought is an output of a process rather than a transparent window onto truth. The voice says something, and the person becomes that statement. Diffusion is the movement in the opposite direction. The recognition that thoughts are thoughts, mental events, linguistic constructions, outputs of a process, and that their occurrence does not make them accurate or obligatory. I notice I am having the thought that I am not good enough is not a therapeutic trick or a rhetorical reframe. It is a structural repositioning. The I that notices is not identical with the voice being noticed. There is a gap between them, and in that gap, for the first time, the narrator is no longer the person, but something the person is watching. Hayes also introduced a distinction that maps with striking precision onto what the Vedantic tradition calls Turiya, and what Watts was pointing toward in the book, the distinction between the thinking self and the observing self. The thinking self is the narrator, the stream of evaluation, planning, memory, and self-commentary that runs more or less continuously. The observing self is whatever is present as the context in which that stream occurs. Hayes was careful, within his clinical framework, not to make strong metaphysical claims about the observing self. He noted that it appears to have no content. It is not an object that can be described. It is a perspective from which things are seen. He noted that it seems to be stable across time in a way the thinking self is not. The narrative changes. The voice says different things in different moods. The self-concept shifts, revises, updates. But the awareness in which all of this occurs seems from the inside to remain constant. The river changes its surface continuously. The bank from which you watch it does not. Whether Hayes' observing self and Maharshi's Turiya and Watt's description of what lies beneath the skin-encapsulated ego are pointing at the same structure. This is a question neither clinical psychology nor academic philosophy can definitively answer. What can be said is that from three radically different investigative traditions, arriving from different starting points, different concerns, and different methodological commitments, the same shape keeps emerging. A distinction between the narrating process and the awareness in which narrating occurs. A distinction between the voice and whatever is listening. A distinction that, once felt rather than merely understood, appears to change the relationship to the narrating mind, without requiring the narrating mind to stop. This is the part that tends to be misunderstood. The misunderstanding is almost universal, and it is almost always the same. The expectation that understanding the voice is not the self will produce silence. It does not. The voice does not stop when you see it more clearly. If anything, the first effect of seeing it is that you hear it more loudly, because you are no longer inside it, and what was background noise becomes suddenly audible as noise. This is temporarily disorienting. People who have this experience for the first time often interpret it as something going wrong. The mind is getting louder. The commentary is getting more intrusive. What they have actually encountered is the difference between the voice as climate, unnoticed, total, ambient, and the voice as weather, present, localized, passing through. Watts himself was not a quiet man. His actual voice, the one preserved in hundreds of hours of recorded lectures, was warm, rapid, frequently ironic, occasionally raucous, full of laughter at the more audacious philosophical implications of what he was saying. He was not describing a state of permanent inner silence. He was describing something more structural, a shift in relationship. The voice continues. The imprisonment ends, not because the walls come down, but because something recognizes that the walls were never load-bearing. They were held in place by the belief that the voice was the prisoner, that there was no one who was not the voice. There is a passage Watts returns to across multiple books and lectures in different forms, but with a consistent center. What he called the game of hide and seek the universe plays with itself. The totality of existence, the whole process, not as a metaphysical abstraction, but as the actual, immediate, present fact of things, generates local eyes. It produces points of view, temporary, specific, mortal perspectives from which the whole can be partially glimpsed. And in generating these local perspectives, the whole conceals its own wholeness from itself. A local eye cannot see the wholeness it is part of. It is too close. It is that wholeness, from a particular angle, which is the same as saying it cannot see itself seeing. The game, if it can be called a game, is the gradual re-recognition, through individual human awareness, of what it always was. The wave recognizing the ocean, not as a concept, not as a belief adopted after sufficient philosophical study, as a direct, present fact, the kind of fact that makes the word fact feel slightly inadequate. The voice in your head is one of those local eyes. It is the universe looking through a specific temporary aperture. It evaluates because evaluation is part of how it navigates. It narrates because narration is part of how it builds a working map of the territory. It worries because anticipating and modeling futures is one of the things it evolved to do. None of this is pathological. None of it requires fixing. The problem, if that word still applies, and after this kind of investigation it begins to feel imprecise, is not the voice. It is the exclusive identification with the voice, the foreclosure of any relationship to the awareness in which the voice is occurring. The assumption that the narrator is the totality of what is present. The voice is still running. Right now, as these sentences conclude, it is already beginning to comment on them, agreeing or disagreeing, finding them too abstract or not abstract enough. wondering what to do with any of this, generating a story about what kind of person engages with this kind of material. That commentary is not something to suppress. It may not even be something that can be suppressed, any more than you could silence the sound of a river by wanting it to stop. But something else is also present. It was present before the first word of this reached you, and it will be present after the last. It is what heard the voice this morning, before you had decided what to think about it. It does not evaluate. It does not rehearse or worry or compare. It receives. Everything that has ever happened in your experience has happened to it, and it has never been damaged by any of it, because you cannot damage the space in which things occur by putting things into it. This is not a poetic description. It is a structural one. The voice narrates. Something receives the narration. And the one who is listening, quietly, prior to all judgment, prior to all story, is not the voice. Watts, at the end of a seminar at Esalen in 1969, said something that has stayed in the record in various transcriptions and recollections. He said, paraphrasing his central argument, "The sensation of being a lonely, isolated center of consciousness is a hallucination. Not a mistake you made, not a character flaw. A hallucination built into the structure of the symbolic mind, one that the whole culture reinforces, that language itself reinforces, that the first-person singular pronoun reinforces every time it is used. The cure for a hallucination is not effort, it is seeing. The voice is not you. That much is visible, if you look. The listening, open, prior, already present, might be something else entirely. And what that something is has no name the narrator can speak, because the narrator is one of the things it watches. Which is why, after everything that can be said about it has been said, the investigation eventually stops producing words, and simply opens.